because we really do want to address and acknowledge the news that came out yesterday about inflation in New Zealand and the conversation, how terrible it is and how bad it is. Look, I actually would challenge that. It's not that I would challenge it. It's bad. 6.9% is bad. But what I will challenge is why it's bad and what this government did to get it there, or how they responded. We'll go through that in a second. But first, let's just, if you haven't seen it, and I'm sure you've seen it somewhere, have a look at the headlines from One News last night when they were talking about inflation. And one of the things I wanted to show is I think it's always important for us to keep in mind where we are in the rest of the world. Because yes, 6.9% is bad, but where is it compared to other like-minded countries? Where is it compared to how they're going through it? Are we doing better or worse than what's happening in the OECD at the moment?
We've been telling you for a while now how we're paying more for things. Now, official confirmation the cost of living has skyrocketed. Inflation has soared to 6.9% in the 3 months to March. The 1 point increase on the previous quarter is the biggest jump in more than 30 years. The figure, which measures the annual increase in prices for certain goods and services, is lower than many economists had forecast. It's being driven by rising...
So let's just make that first point. There was interviews, I don't think yesterday, but maybe the day before, or maybe it was yesterday, where Mr. Luxon was saying that the inflation is going to be well over 7% later today. It's going to come out, it's going to be well over 7%. Many economists were saying it'll be well over 7%. So actually, we'll say it again, 6.9% is bad. But compared to what the economists and the opposition were saying, it's better than they were expecting.
Construction costs, rents, petrol, and increasing costs overseas for food and second-hand cars.
The other thing that's important to point out, that the things that are driving inflation up, much of it is completely uncontrollable by many aspects of society. We can't control the cost of oil. Government can't really control the cost of rent. We can't really control the cost of second-hand cars. Although you could argue, taxes, GST, that kind of stuff. But in general, we can't. And the cost of construction is going up a lot because of demand around the world and because there is a shortage of things like jib all over the world. All of those things, pretty much, the government can't control. Cost of food that comes from offshore, government can't really control. Do they have some control over cost from food produced in New Zealand? Yeah. But the stuff that comes from offshore, no, not so much.
But we're not the only ones suffering as the Ukraine conflict, COVID, and global supply issues continue to take a toll. For better context, 7.7% is the total inflation rate for the OECD group.
So when she says total inflation rate, that's the average. So 7.7 is the average. So if you're above 7.7, you're doing worse than the average. If you're below 7.7, you're doing better than the average. We're 6.9.
Group of countries. It's 8.5% in the United States and hitting 7% in the UK just last week, a 30-year high there. Our neighbours Australia is lower at 3.5%, but that's expected to go up when their latest figures are released next week.
So what you're saying at the moment a lot, as well as various lobby groups and stuff putting out Australia as the example. There's no question Australia is doing better than New Zealand, 3.5%. And if we follow the same model that's happened in New Zealand, we've just jumped by a 1%. Maybe they'll be 4.5% to 5%, which is still significantly better than New Zealand. But they appear to be within our, when I say like-minded, similar sorts of countries, to be the outlier, not the example.
Katie Bradford has more on.
That's what we've got from there anyway. So that was the first part of that conversation. We then, in the same report, wanted to move into what the politicians were saying, because the politicians are now responding, as you would expect. The opposition are saying it's got everything to do with the government. The government is doing, is throwing their hands in the air, saying, well, what do you expect? What should we have done? What should we have cut? Let's have a quick look at that as well.
Hey, listen, Grant Robertson, you're addicted to spending.
Labor plans to spend an extra $6 billion in next month's budget.
And it's just putting inflationary fuel on the fire. We're not talking about cutting services or having austerity, but what we're saying is let's be really thoughtful and intentional about that.
What spending do people not want us to undertake?
It's a good question.
If you're thinking about the kinds of spending that a government might do that would be big enough to really have an impact on inflation, you're thinking about things like the wage subsidy scheme. Is that what people are saying we shouldn't have done?
Many of the factors driving it.
So that's an example, and when we've got another part we're going to play about this, but I want to give you a chance to chime in first if you want to, George.
Yeah, it's interesting.
That's the example of the oppositional MP. The government's doing terrible. We would do better. Of course, the follow-up question is how, which we didn't get an answer to. And
Right.
and the answer
It's-
is they wouldn't have anything specifically. What would you cut? And they wouldn't have anything specifically to that. So that's oppositional politics. George, yours.
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to reflect on that point, right? He says, "Oh, it wouldn't be austerity," but then what is it? What? And then sort of vaguely at the end says, "We're gonna, we'll still be spending, but like better or something."
Yeah.
Which is the opposite of what they're saying, right? That we shouldn't be spending. When he said Grant Robertson is addicted, I thought he was going to say something,
Is a dick.
something else.
Grant Robinson is a dick. Oh, sheesh.
Um,
It's a bit hard, Mr. Luxon.
but what a great response from Grant Robertson, eh?
Yeah.
Like,
I mean, that's always the case. It's always the case that you go, okay. I mean, basically, Grant Robinson almost did the job of the journalist. You know, so we're spending too much. Where should the cuts be? It's a fair question. And look, I guess I haven't seen the government books. I don't have them in front of me. I can't go. We should do cut. Maybe there are places there should be cuts. Let's be fair. But the thing we're talking about today about the difference between an oppositional party for New Zealand that is a right party at the moment and how terrible the Republicans are is that was an oppositional party being an oppositional party. That was the oppositional party saying, we could do it better. We could do it better. How would you do it better? You'll find out closer to the election, but it's not actually, he's not actually going, we're going to close down. We're going to get rid of all the social welfare in the country. And then when they get into power, they attempt to get rid of all the social welfare in the country, which is what the Republicans do. They come up with terrible policies when they're in opposition, and then they try and enact them. An oppositional party comes up with poking the bear that is the government, but then doesn't change that much when they get into government.
I think that it shows that the climate, the political climate, is such at the moment that the National wouldn't be able to say we're going to cut spending on these specific programs without it negatively affecting their polls, right? I think that's why there's sort of because oppositional parties do get a little bit more specific than that. The right wing love to say we're going to cut this or cut taxes or whatever it is.
Yeah,
but I think he just doesn't really have the political space to move that far towards specificity.
Yeah. So then, of course, to wrap up this part of the conversation around inflation, the question is why and how have we got to 6.9%, right? And so News Hub last night had a really, really interesting conversation. He's an economist, and they refer to him as an independent economist. Now, I'm assuming that means he's not affiliated with any bank or group, although he does some writings. If you look up his name, Mike Riddell is his name. Mike Riddell, sorry, is his name. And he is by no means, you can hear in his ideas for how to correct this and fix this, signaling an easy ride for a left government. So let's make that clear to start off with. He was asked by News Hub last night, who's responsible? Because the reporter there is like, the infighting started. Who's to blame here? Where do you stand on this? And we're going to play all this pretty much all the way through, because I've said it before, and many of you will roll your eyes when I say it again, but I believe in leading a horse to water. I want us, me included, to understand why this inflation is there. Is there someone to blame, and what can be done about it? Rather than just pearl clutching and pointing fingers and yelling, you're to blame, and having the other guys go, no, we're not. I actually want to know and learn why this is there and what can be done about it. And this conversation, I think, is the start of the learning for me, and maybe hopefully it'll be some of the learning for you as well. So the conversation starts with him being asked who's responsible for this, inflation.
Oh, pretty clearly the ultimate responsibility rests with the Reserve Bank. They're given an inflation target by the government. They're given independent powers to adjust monetary policy, and poor inflation outcomes, particularly trend inflation, the persistent bits of it, are only the Reserve Bank's responsibility. Whatever the government does in terms of increasing spending or cutting taxes, there are all sorts of things the Reserve Bank has to take into account when it makes its interest rate decisions. And it's quite clear that they and a lot of other people badly misforecast where things were going a year or so ago and had policy in the wrong place. And then when they finally realised that they needed to be raising interest rates in the middle of last year, they were pretty slow to adjust. The responsibility rests with them. Now, they can't control oil prices, short-term fluctuations there. But what they'll be focusing on, and what they should be focusing on, is that when they strip out those one-off influences and see that core inflation is now running well above the bank's 1 to 3% target.
So what exactly did...
So the first thing is, we'll just keep going, because one of the things he says, or is about to say, I don't want to, that's why I said we'll just keep going, is that the Reserve Bank thought the economy would be worse than it is. In other words, this government has done better with the economy than what the Reserve Bank was predicting. So therefore, the Reserve Bank put in place some policies that don't suit what the reality of the economy is right now. That's hopefully I haven't just cut him off and he's about to say this, but that's what he has started to say, and probably what he will continue to say.
Did they get wrong then? Which things did they under or overestimate?
Oh, here we go.
Ultimately, they underestimated the extent to which the economy was going to recover strongly. If you look back at their forecasts in February last year, they expected that unemployment would stick around 5% right through this period. In fact, it's been 3.2%. Now, 3.2% is an unemployment rate that this economy simply can't sustain without having rising inflation. Pretty much all economists think that unemployment probably needs to be between 4 and 4.5% to be consistent with stable inflation. And so, having misjudged that, they then misjudged where monetary policy needed to be, where the OCR needed to be, for example. And it wasn't until October last year that they started raising rates. Now, when you raise the OCR, it takes the best part of 9 to 12 months to really start having much effect on inflation. So today's inflation outcomes are the result of those erroneous choices they were making a year ago.
Okay, so given...
So I'm laughing at the erroneous choices. So basically, the Reserve Bank thought this government wasn't going to do as well as they have. Well, certainly the economy wouldn't be as good as it is. They put things in place then for an economy that was going to be worse. And now that it's better, their decisions of 9 to 12 months ago is the cause or the reason of the inflation today. It's pretty hard to hear. And you're right, this gets worse. When I say gets worse, it gets harsher. He's basically saying, oh, we need more unemployed people. You know, we need more people to lose jobs right now. That's what we need to help fix the economy. And we need rates to go up. We need the OCR to be higher. And I know most of you know this, and I'm not trying to educate you or tell you how to suck eggs, but for people who have mortgages, the OCR going up is a terrible thing. For people who have bank deposits and savings, the OCR going up is a fantastic thing, because rates go up. So your savings rates go up and your mortgage rates go up. I read something the other day that something like 40% of first home buyers, if you purchase in the last 12 months, if the mortgage rates hit 6%, which they probably will, are going to be financially in pretty hard times, potentially having to pay thousands of dollars more per month for their mortgages when they get their new rates after they come off their sort of 2-year rates. So he's saying the OCR should have started to go up earlier. It didn't. And we won't see the changes in the OCR now for 9 to 12 months, the changes in the inflation in the economy. I'm going to keep going, George. Does anyone want to jump in on before that?
No, you're good.
We'll keep going.
Nat, where do you see it going from here? Because they have now raised interest rates. So are things going to turn around?
They will need to raise them quite a bit further. And I think the governor more or less indicated that in the interview that he did with the IMF the other day. The OCR adjusted for inflation is now lower than it was 2 years ago. It needs to be higher than it was to get inflation down again. We've got a substantially overheated domestic economy. That's that unemployment rate. And we need to see things slowing down. On their own, they won't slow down. And so interest rates need to be raised quite a bit further to engender a slowdown in the economy and probably a rise in the unemployment rate.
Okay, that's going to scare a lot of people, more unemployment and higher interest rates. Just very quickly here, what should the politicians be doing here? What should Grant Robertson be doing in this budget?
There's not a lot that it makes sense for the politicians to be doing in the budget. I mean, the way in which conventional policy has been seen over the last few decades is you want fiscal policy to focus on the things that we elect politicians for, you know, the right tax policy, the right spending policies. You don't want them chopping and changing every few months. Monetary policy, by contrast, can be changed really easily. And we've put that at arm's length from politicians and said to the Reserve Bank, it's your job to keep things in check. Now, the sooner the Reserve Bank gets on and raises interest rates, the less disruptive it's likely to be. The biggest risk is that they continue to adjust only quite slowly. Inflation rises further from here, and then we need a recession to get things down.
Okay. It's all a little bit grim.
I love it. It's like
this evening, Michael.
it's this big, huge, like ungodly, divine thing that we have no power over. I mean,
Yeah.
maybe the technocrats at the Reserve Bank, but the politicians, nah, that they can't really do anything.
But
It's so it's
this is the
helpless.
point.
I feel
Yeah, but
helpless.
I think this is the thing. And look, I don't understand all of this because I don't understand why interest rates going up significantly and quickly is going to be helpful to the economy, because all I can think about is people trying to pay their mortgages, or people who are trying to rent, who now have to rent off people whose mortgages have just gone up. I don't understand how that all helps, and I don't understand it, which is when I say at the start of this piece, I want to learn, and I want to learn together. I want us to what is it? I've forgotten my own saying. Take a horse to water. I want to go to the water, and this is I guess at least me starting to drink as well. But let's just be clear what he said. He said the Reserve Bank is pretty much the only group that can affect inflation. He said they read the economy wrong, and he said that the Reserve Bank expected the economy to be doing worse, and so they set the wrong things in place. He said they're now playing catch up, my words, not his, because they're perhaps 9 to 12 months behind. And he said really for this he also said in the budget there's nothing the government can really do. And he said for this to actually work its way out, we need to have more unemployed people, we need to have highest interest rates, and perhaps a recession. And so when you think about it like that, at least when I think about it like that, I'm like, with all the politics now, we're talking about oppositional politics, kind of jawing at each other. Maybe that is the definition of politicking. Maybe that is the definition of point scoring, and maybe that is why an oppositional party can't go, well, this is what we'd do. They actually know only the Reserve Bank has the power to actually make a change, and they've dropped the ball.
Yeah, I guess they can still vaguely point to inflation and cost of living and that sort of thing, and pin that on the current government. But you're right in terms of, well, just as they said, the monetary policy is with the Reserve Bank, and there's not much more. Which, and we should make it clear, contradicts Luxon's talking point that somehow Labor's spending is increasing inflation, right?
Yeah. Now, part of my learning, and I'll hand on heart, is if he's an outlier to all the other economists, I want to know that. It's one that I saw last night whilst watching News Hub, and I thought, oh, that's interesting, and I wanted to talk about it. My job now and my design now is to go through and find out, is he speaking with one voice? Are all the economists saying this? And if all the economists are saying a similar thing, and all the people who have the knowledge are saying a similar thing, then actually that's the knowledge I need to be able to know the truth about inflation and what's happening and how it can be affected, as opposed to perhaps hearing a talking point or a bullet point from a political party trying to score points against their opposition.